All right, so we're getting there. I've built up a lot of different layers and experiments. And so what I'm going to do before I move on beyond just duotone color to full spectrum color and some special effects, like you can see on this Nico example, once you have your duotones in, your light and your dark, then you can do little things like changing the outline color or even having color holds over the top, and even deepening color within your duotones, or even adding a different color, which would be full spectrum. Going back to our handout, full spectrum is when I added kind of purple and pinks into the lemon here. Instead of just variations on the yellow. And you can do that. It can get overdone pretty easily. So you want to be mindful and careful of it. All right. So what I'm going to do is try to understand all my layers and walk you through them. And that can be very helpful by having a colored background, or at least a gray background, so you can see what's actually painted on. So first, my top layer is my clean vector. If your vector layer is not on top of all your other coloring layers, then you are kind of endangering your lines, right? The only layer that should be above your vector layers are what we call color holds. And so I'm going to add that now, and I'll go back to it. I'll call this color holds. This is a special effect. And you can see it here on Nico where I have little glints on his armor. That's a color hold that goes over and above the black outline. So on a color hold, I might decide to, for instance, make a little white star right here. Fill that in with solid white. And that goes on top of my black line work, right? I can stretch it out. I can warp it. I can rotate it. This is just a pure color shape, like a glint on a sword, right? I can Gaussian blur it a lot or a little. I can play with its opacity. But you see it's going above the line work. So that's what makes it a color hold. I'll warp it to make it a little fancier. Okay, but more about that later. Now I could take that and I could duplicate it or copy and paste it and do these stars kind of everywhere. Like put one in the eye, scale it down, a little glint, you know, duplicate another one, put it somewhere else. And those would be kind of special effects on it, right? And I can play with those more later, but those will all be what are called color holds. So I'll merge those all together. And I'm going to mark that yellow. I'm going to mark my vector line work red. It's good to organize layers. I'm going to mark my soft-edged gradation, which is a duotone, that runs behind. I'll label that green. It's not necessary, but it's there. It's an effect I chose. And then I have a few different duotone effect layers. I have a soft edge duotone layer, very subtle. You can see it there. Then I have a harder edge duotone layer there. Then I have a duotone highlight. duotone color highlights, because they're not just white. They're lighter versions of the flat color. That's there. I just have it around his head. Then I have my flat white highlights. I think I want to blur those a little bit more. Then I have my flat, nope, this is the duotone internal highlight. So I have quite a few duotone layers going on. So what I'm going to do is make a folder of them that I call duotone layers. And so you make a new folder or a new group, and then you just select all those duotone layers and drag them into that group, which allows me to just turn them on and off so you can see how effective they are. Okay, and then underneath it all, I just have my flat color, my backgrounds. There's my duotone. There are my color holds on top. Now, putting them into a group is really helpful because sometimes we overdo it with our duotones, even if they're on lots of different layers, and then we could just take the opacity down a little bit and decide how much we actually want. How much do we want it to actually modify our flat color? And I probably want it to modify at about 85%. Because if I take it all the way to 100, that just seems a little bit too strong. About 85%. It's good to pick an age you want to live until. So err on the top side. Okay. And if you want 100, you're just greedy. And you definitely don't want more than 100. No. We have few enough resources as it is. All right. So the flat colors running behind, they're still essential, right? They're filling in a lot of this, especially the outside of the design. Now, what if I want to do beyond just duotone effects? What if I want to do something just kind of nutty? And where's kind of a big focal point that I haven't done much with? Well, the bird's eye, I've just kind of left pretty simple intentionally because I want these to be read equally as eyes. But the head is kind of dull too. And if I wanted to really bring these eyes out, maybe I would do something more with these wings. So what I'm going to do is use the Move tool and auto-select by layer and select these wing shadows here. Because I am going to use these. Oops. Yeah, maybe these areas. Maybe this one too. As a place to experiment with what's called full spectrum color. So then I'll get out of my duotone layers. I'm just going to move that selection onto a new layer. I'm going to call this full spectrum color. And that's when I can go beyond blues. And I can use the complements of blues if I want, or any color I want. So to really make it clear what this is, I'm going to use a gradient, go to the gradient tool, and I'm going to use a rainbow. And I do this actually quite a bit when I do full spectrum color. I use this really strong rainbow and I just paint a gradient in those shapes. Right? That's pretty out there. Now, I don't need to select it anymore because it's on its own layer. So I haven't done any damage. Now I can play with the opacity of it and decide like how much of it do I really want. This full spectrum. I like that rainbow gradient because it gives you warms and cools. And if you use it as an opacity, you know, obviously I don't think I want it at full saturation here. That's a little overwhelming. But you can play it at different opacities and it will blend with your duotone color in this case and make those a little bit more dramatic. You guys see that? So full spectrum color should probably not be used everywhere because it screams, look at me. But if you need to strengthen a focal point, that can be a really useful tool. So we've got flat color, we've got duotone layers, we've got some that are hard edged, some that are soft edged, but mostly hard edge. The soft edge is really that gradient running behind, which I'll label green. And that makes a big difference, right? And then we've got the flat color running underneath. That is pretty light. Now, what's the other special effect I can do besides duotone? Or besides full spectrum? Or is there any other area I want to play with full spectrum? Well, let's be bold. I'm going to take the flat colors. I'm going to duplicate or select all of them. Just this outer rim. Move them up to my above my full spectrum colors, right? And I am going to fill that with that rainbow gradient. Maybe I'll go a different direction this time. But I just want within the color. There we go. Okay. Now if I select chunks of it like that, gradations allow you to do this pretty easily because it's a linear gradation. Select little portions. Some thin, some thick. You can vary it based on the tolerance you allow. This is going to break up my illustration in some interesting ways, just to play with. So this is where you can kind of really go nuts with full spectrum color if you want to. But it only works if the coloring underneath makes sense. All right, so now I can play with different blending styles, like overlay or soft light. You know, it just gives a little bit of extra emphasis. And of course, you can play with the opacity of it. So it's a way of kind of breaking up your colors by putting a full spectrum overlay on top. And if you think it's too strong, you can always blur it out. I love Gaussian blur. It's the only filter we use heavily because you can control the softness of it. So give us kind of an organic variation. Pin light, low opacity. Kind of muddies it a little bit. And I didn't do this as a layer style, I painted this as a gradation, which allows me to also play with the hue saturation of it. I think I like soft light the best. Yeah, it's subtle. And then I can go to image, adjustment, hue saturation, and try the different variations. You'll see how subtle they are of these. So, you know, do I want it to go more purple? Do I want it to go more green? That looks pretty good. Yeah, and it just gives it a little extra emphasis. Kind of gets us focused on those eyes. So that's without it.